Hello class, this is Professor Isaac, and in this lecture we're going to be going over conventional and sustainable agriculture. So we're going to look at different things about farming and how food is grown, and we're going to compare how conventional agriculture produces food, and we're going to compare what's different about sustainable agriculture. Before we do that, we're going to get a little bit of background information about what it takes to grow crops. So things like what is soil like, what types of pesticides might be used. So by the end of this lecture, you'll have a good introduction to how agriculture works, what are some of the dangers of it, and what are some ways that we can improve agriculture in the future. So let's get started by looking first at soil. So your textbook does a really good job of introducing the concept of growing crops from the earth, right? And so when we think about how those crops grow, certainly we water them and certainly they get energy from the sun, but the soil is also an important component of crop growth. And so when we think of a plant growing, the medium that they're growing through is soil. So when we think of what soil is made of, it's made of organic materials, and those would be things like carbon, hydrogen, small amounts of oxygen, nitrogen, and then they also have mineral deposits, right? And those can vary depending on what state we're in, what continent we're talking about. So the makeup of the soil and its composition is different depending on how humid an area is. Certain parts of the eastern United States even have clay as part of the soil, like a red clay. Some places will have a much more rich, fertile soil. Let's say, for example, in a tropical rainforest, the soil will be really rich and moist. So the word we use to describe the organic matter of soil is humus. So it sounds like hummus, but we're referring to the organic components of soil. And so when we look at things like fertilizers or pesticides, those would be often synthetic compounds that are not organic, that are added to the humus, right? And that material, all of that material in the humus can be used by the roots of the plants as they're growing. So why is this so important? Well, the materials in the soil and the elements in the soil actually provide a foundation for what we grow, right? What crops are being produced in agriculture directly use components from the soil. So you may remember in previous lectures, we went over those biogeochemical cycles. We talked about how carbon moves through an ecosystem. We talked about how nitrogen moves through an ecosystem. We talked about even water and phosphorus and sulfur. So when we think about the fact that acid rain, for example, in a cloud as it's falling down, now allows small amounts of that sulfur oxide to go into the soil. So as these nutrients and elements cycle through an ecosystem, they're also part of the soil, right? Nitrogen plays a big role through nitrogen fixation. If you remember that, that's going to be part of the soil. So when we think about a soil profile, we're thinking about all of these different components that come together to make this medium for crops to grow. So what are the things that can affect the soil, right? We want to think about the climate. That definitely plays a huge role in soil composition. When we think about, let's say, an area that has a lot of rain compared to a climate that's really dry, that can make a huge difference. Different parts of the world also have different organisms living underneath the ground. So for example, you can have different types of bacteria that live in the soil. You can also have small organisms like worms and insects. They all play a role in how soil is formed. Another factor that affects soil is the parent material. Now, the parent material is the underlying geological material that the soil comes from. So, for example, imagine if you dug all the way down to the bottom of soil, you might eventually hit rock. Now, that lower layer forms the parent material that the soil comes from, and that can be different depending on where you are in a given geographical area. So, for example, some parent material will make soil more acidic. Some parent material could make soil more smooth. Some parent material could make soil more wet or more grainy. So, the nature of that parent material, what's way down at the bottom, affects how the soil forms. Soil also changes dramatically over time. Erosion, the amount of pollution in the area, things like industrial runoff, all of that changes how the soil forms, and it changes how the soil can sustain plant life, right? So you might find that in a given area, it was excellent for growing crops maybe 20 years ago, but now some of that soil is no longer efficient in growing plants. So when we think about soil, we want to consider all of the different factors that can change it. So why is it so important to look at the composition of soil? Well, one of the main reasons is because the material that's found in soil ends up forming the tissues of plants, right? And so when we think about how soil and plants interact with one another, it's in a lot of different ways. Number one is just physically supporting a plant, right? So the roots of a plant are physically held up by the soil. Another way that a soil helps plants is by providing them with water, right? So water gets trapped in the soil, and the roots can use that water when there isn't necessarily enough water that's given to the plants, right? If it isn't watered at all, some moisture can be removed from the soil through the roots and then provided to the plant for photosynthesis. Soil also helps give plants heat, right? So they can generate heat from the soil and use that as well. There are also very important nutrients, things like phosphorus, calcium, nitrogen, and those nutrients travel up through the roots to the body of the plant. Oxygen from the atmosphere, if you're looking at this picture on the slide of the oxygen that's floating around in the air, that oxygen also travels through photosynthesis. It gets taken up as carbon dioxide by the plant, and then the plant produces more oxygen. So that cycling that happens also takes place through interactions in the soil. So it's really important when we think about the health of a plant that we also evaluate what the soil was like for that plant to grow. So when we think about what does the plant really get from the soil, we divide the nutrients that a plant gets from the soil into two categories. The first category are called macronutrients. Now these are elements that plants need a ton of. That means that plants really need huge quantities of things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. These are things that plants can use in really big amounts. But there are also nutrients that a plant can use, but they don't necessarily need a lot of it. They can survive and thrive even with just a little bit. So these are called micronutrients. So you can think of the word micro, meaning small, and you can think of the word macro, meaning large. So what are some of the micronutrients? Things that a plant can use, but they don't necessarily have to have large amounts of it. Those are things like iron, manganese, boron, chlorine. Those are elements. They're part of the periodic table, if you remember studying that in chemistry. Those are nutrients that a plant can use, things like iron, but it doesn't need to have a huge amount of iron in the soil. Even tiny amounts of iron the plant can use. For example, a lot of your leafy greens, things like kale, Swiss chard, spinach, collard greens. If you think of those types of dark green vegetables, they tend to be very high in iron. So when we consider where did some of that iron come from, it came from the micronutrients that were present in the soil. And that's good for us, as those nutrients can really help fortify a healthy digestive system for humans when we eat them. So we've gone over soil and what comprises soil. What we're going to think about next is conventional agriculture. Now, when we use the word conventional agriculture, we're thinking of really industrialized farming. We're thinking of agriculture on a large scale. When you think of conventional agriculture, you don't want to envision maybe a person living in a rural area with a really small garden in their backyard. Instead, you're thinking of something like you see in this picture, where you see large-scale crop production, a lot of modern equipment, and we're going to talk in this section about how some of those things have negatively impacted the environment. But one good thing that's come out of really large-scale farming is that we're able to produce a lot of food. So if we were to look at food production, let's say in the 1950s or the 1960s, even in the United States, it was nowhere near the amount of food that we're producing today. So the food production has really increased significantly, and a lot of that is because of a lot of the modern agricultural farming methods that we're going to talk about. So what are some things that we should think of when we think of these kind of conventional agriculture and large-scale farming? Well, one of the things we want to imagine is that there's a lot of investment. So usually this is not going to be one person that just has one farm and they're buying the seeds and then they're growing the crops and then they're selling it. Instead, we're thinking of it being on a much larger scale, right? Where there's a lot of investment into that farm, and then the crops that are being sold and the profit that's being used is actually distributed amongst more than one group of people. Monocultures are really common when we think of conventional agriculture. So what that means is oftentimes you'll have a farm where they're producing only one crop. So if you think of someone planting vegetables in their backyard, they may have some tomatoes and some cucumbers and maybe some avocados. But when we think of conventional agriculture, we're going to think of something like hundreds of acres where it's all corn. They're not necessarily planting lots of different varieties of foods. It's one type of crop, right? So they're producing that one crop on a large scale. That's referred to as a monoculture. We're also going to imagine a lot of mechanization, meaning it's not done by hand, it's done with huge machinery like what you see in the picture on this slide. You're also going to imagine the use of a lot of heavy pesticides and herbicides to kill insects of any kind. And so farming on this scale, they don't want to lose crops, they don't want to lose profit, they don't want to lose any money, so they don't want to risk pests consuming any of their food. So to do that, they just use pesticides on a really large scale. That means they just spray everything, whether there's a pest there or not, they use the pesticide. There's also going to be a lot of use of fertilizers, so to ensure that the crop grows really well. In conventional agriculture, they have a really heavy-handed use of fertilizers as well. So why is this concerning? What are things that can happen when you farm an area in such an aggressive way? If you have a monoculture for, let's say, 200 acres of land, how does that impact the ecosystem? Well, one of the things that can happen is salinization. Salinization describes a process which really causes a lot of salts to accumulate in the soil. And these are water-soluble salts, but over time, when there is really aggressive farming of a particular area, a lot of extra salts start to bind materials in the soil. And that really decreases the growth of crops in that area because then they're not able to take up water as easily. And so salinization is a really big concern. Desertification is also a concern. That's what you're seeing in the picture on the slide. As the area is not able to take up as much water, meaning as the soil loses water, it can become more and more dry. And so desertification of a lot of large areas of land has been seen in many ecosystems, not just in the United States. It's been seen in portions of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. There's been a lot of desertification. Another area for concern is water pollution. So chemical and manufacturing industries that dump chemical waste into the water can eventually end up in the soil that is used in agriculture. So having decreased amounts of water, having less land, so a decreased area for crops to grow. The increased use of fossil fuels has also caused an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon dioxide emissions are increasing, which decreases the efficacy of crops growing well. So all of these are really important ecological concerns because as we grow crops on such a large scale, we also want to consider how is that affecting the ecosystem in that area, right? Usually those farms grow and produce crops annually back to back without a lot of break for the land and without a lot of time to rest and recover any of that soil. And so oftentimes the entire area is being depleted of a lot of the nutrients and minerals available in that soil, but we continue to grow in that exact same area. So we've talked about some concerns related to ecosystems. What about concerns related to the economy? Well, that's also an issue because we want to think about paying workers a fair wage, right? And so farmers, migrant workers all deserve to be given a fair wage. And so agribusiness refers to how much each person in an agricultural supply chain is paid. And so when we think of really large-scale farms, they often will employ fewer farmers, right? Because they're using a lot of industrialized equipment. And so then the farmers often aren't the ones that are dictating their own salary. Instead, it's owned by, let's say, a large capital industry. And so in the long run, that's a concern because we want all people to be earning a living wage, right? There's also concern for farmers and laborers in agriculture that are exposed to a lot of really harmful pesticides. Earlier in the course, we talked about DDT and exposure to pesticides, exposure to really harmful nitrates, sometimes in fertilizer, and that can over time cause health concerns, right? There have been a lot of linkages to the use of pesticides and a lot of health diseases. Another issue is antibiotic resistance, and for this we're not talking about people getting antibiotic resistance, we're actually referring to the cattle or the livestock. Oftentimes they are given antibiotics whether or not they're sick, just to make sure that they don't get sick, right? And so that leads to more and more antibiotic usage, and then they have to use stronger antibiotics because then the livestock become resistant to it, right? So the more and more we use antibiotics, the more dependent on them we become. So that's a really important concern when we think about human health, right? Because then we consume that livestock, and then how does that impact our health? Another really important thing to consider when we think about agriculture and farming and soil are the use of pesticides. And pesticides have a good purpose, meaning they kill harmful pests and they can destroy them and they can protect a crop. That's a good thing, right? So for example, if there's a specific crop that's being eaten by a specific pest, killing them allows us to protect the crop and the farmer to still produce something that they can sell. the danger becomes when a lot of the pesticides are so strong that the application of the pesticides then causes excess chemicals to be present in the soil, and then increased concentrations of those pesticides to be present in the plant, right? So the question is, how much is dangerous, how much pesticides should be used, how much of it directly affects us, right? That's where a lot of debate arises, because there are differing opinions on what pesticides should be used, how much should they be sprayed, how much of that impacts the crops, and how much of it do we get when we ingest it, right? So when we think about a pesticide, we're really thinking about a chemical substance, right? And when we think about why they're often chemical or synthetic, it's because that's usually the best way to kill the pests. So what is a pest? Basically, a pest can be described as anything that's unwanted. So it's not necessarily an insect, but it's something that is damaging the crop, that is damaging the livestock, or even, let's say, hurting the humans in the area, right? So we're going to look at pesticides and see what are some of the problems associated with them. So, like I mentioned just in the slide before this one, oftentimes when we talk about pesticides, we're referring to chemicals and synthetic compounds, and we generally associate them as a negative item because of the health effects that are associated with pesticides. But one good thing that has come from pesticide use is that we are able to produce an increased quantity of crops. So because of the use of pesticides, we have increased our food production, right? We're able to kill a lot of organisms that feed on the crops and limit how much they're able to consume. One of the ways that chemical pesticides have been useful is in decreasing the spread of disease. So one example of a disease that has killed millions of people a year is malaria, and malaria is spread by a mosquito. And so using pesticides decreases the amount of mosquitoes that can survive. So malaria is still a very common cause of death, not in the United States, but especially in developing nations. And the success that we've seen in decreasing malaria is largely due to the use of pesticides. So although they are dangerous in terms of agriculture, pesticides have been useful in protecting humans from many diseases. One kind of common example of that is malaria. So why are we so worried about pesticides then? Well, the real reason is because there are negative impacts on human health, right? The more we ingest crops that have been farmed with the use of pesticides, the more we're concerned about how much that pesticide usage is linked to our own health. So studies have shown that prolonged exposure to pesticides, that means when you're around it for a long time, especially for agricultural workers, or when you've consumed a lot of food with a lot of pesticides, it has been linked to lymphoma, leukemia, some forms of heart disorders, some brain disorders, some types of dermatological issues, things like contact dermatitis and skin disorders. Hematological symptoms refers to blood, so there are certain blood disorders that are associated with a lot of exposure to pesticides. We see that in migrant workers and in farmers that are exposed to pesticides, all of these conditions are much more common than they are in people that are not exposed to the pesticides. So the linkage between pesticide usage and a lot of dangerous health problems has been established, right? The issue is how much causes it and how much is safe, right? That's where a lot of people have differing opinions. So this is an image showing you a lot of those same health impacts that we saw on the previous slide. They're just describing them with a little bit more detail and showing you pictures of those as well. You wouldn't have to list all of the things on this particular picture on an exam. The previous slide is enough detail, but it's just for you to know how serious it is and how closely associated the pesticides are with negative health impacts, right? They've shown, especially with children, that exposure to a lot of pesticide usage can be really dangerous in their development and how their brains form and how their nervous system functions. One of the other really important ways that pesticides have affected human health is fertility. So they've shown a lot of things where people exposed to pesticides often have infertility. They have changes in the quantities of the hormones that their body produces, changes, for example, in the health of the developing embryo. And so that's one of the really dangerous side effects that's associated with pesticides. So you can review this particular image, but you wouldn't be asked any specific questions from this particular picture. So we've gone over a lot of the key factors associated with conventional agriculture, right? Producing things in a really large scale. Now we're going to look at the opposite of that, which is sustainable agriculture. So when we think about conventional and sustainable, how are they different? Well, sustainable agriculture is really focusing on, number one, the future, really looking at, if we produce this crop, how will this affect the ecosystem in the future? They're really considering the future effects and the future impacts of what they're currently doing today. Whereas when we think of conventional agriculture, what we were talking about on the previous slide, it's not really done with a lot of focus on the future. Conventional agriculture really focuses on what can I grow today, what can I sell today, how can I make a profit as soon as possible. Sustainable agriculture really focuses on the environment and how will the production of this particular crop affect the environment. How can we sustain this same crop growth in the future? How will it affect the economy? It also takes into consideration how farmers are impacted, whether this is good for farmers, and then it also looks at humans' needs, right? The humans that are eating this crop, will it be good for them? Is it good for their diet? Is this a good way to look after the ecosystem and the people that need this product or need this crop? So sustainable agriculture is really thought of as a much better way of growing and producing foods. So a big part of sustainable agriculture is organic farming. And so when we look at what does it mean for something to be organic, when we think of, let's say, organic beef, or let's say organic chicken or an organic egg, what's different about an organic product versus a regular product? Well, the idea is that an organic product would have been grown with no antibiotics and without the use of growth hormones. So, for example, livestock are often injected with growth hormone to make them grow bigger faster so that they become larger so that you can sell more beef, for example, right? If you inject a cow with a lot of growth hormone, you get a bigger cow. So then you can sell more beef. Versus organic cattle would be cattle that grew on their own, maybe not as quickly, but they didn't have hormones injected into them, and so they would be described as having less of those synthetic compounds in them. When we think of organic food, it's food that's grown without using fertilizer, without using chemical synthetic compounds, without using pesticides. The water, for example, can't be polluted with things like sewage sludge. There can't be any genetically modified organisms. If you remember, that's what we covered in our previous lecture. So when we look at organic farming, it's really aiming to be as natural as possible and to produce food that has the fewest amount of chemicals. So when we think of farming in this way, we're really often using renewable resources. So for example, rather than abusing the burning of fossil fuels, instead we're often focusing on things like using biomass, using energy from the sun, solar energy, conserving the amount of water that's used, oftentimes by using, let's say, drip irrigation systems, small amounts of water, sustainable efforts to restore the soil after a crop has been grown, really looking at what we're putting into the environment, how we're affecting the ecosystem. So when we look at sustainable agriculture, the goals of it are really different than the goals of traditional conventional agriculture. The goal of sustainable agriculture is not just to make a profit, it's also to look at what might be best for the environment and for the surrounding ecosystems. One of the ways that sustainable agriculture achieves these goals is by using IPM. So IPM is something called Integrated Pest Management. And IPM uses natural pests that can control a dangerous organism rather than using a pesticide. So it's basically like finding a natural pest control. And by doing this, we reduce the amount of chemical pesticides that we have to rely on. So when we think about using IPM, it often won't get rid of the pest entirely. It will just decrease the amount of them. So you may not be able to protect 100% of the crops, but you would be able to decrease how many of them are affected. In general, when we look at IPM measures, we're trying to not use synthetic compounds, trying not to use chemicals and pesticides, and to find a way to naturally kill a pest without necessarily negatively affecting the environment, and by decreasing how much humans would be affected. So what's an example of this? An example of this is in Australia. There was an invasive species called a cottony cushion scale, and that organism, this little thing right here, is actually dangerous because it sucks the sap from the trees, and so it then decreases the amount of fruit and the amount of product that a tree can produce. And so as these cottony cushion scales were taking over, normally what would have been done is that scale would have been sprayed with a pesticide that would kill all the cottony cushion scales. Well, an example of IPM, and a really successful example in Australia, is when they introduced a natural predator. So the natural predator of this cottony cushion scale is a beetle. So these little Vidalia beetles eat or consume this cottony cushion scale. So when you increase these beetles, they don't harm anything, but they eat your pest that you don't necessarily want. So here you're seeing the population density of the cottony cushion scale, and then you can see how this blue line decreased once the Vidalia beetle was introduced. And some people might wonder, well, what if the Vidalia beetles take over? Well, usually they'll try to use a predator that isn't dangerous, but you'll notice that as they kill the cottony cushion scales, they also decrease, meaning their own population declines. So over time, you're having less and less and less of the predator that you introduced into the area. So IPM isn't necessarily a perfect solution, but it does offer a way biologically where we can use a natural solution to get rid of a pest. So rather than using harmful, harsh chemicals, we can try to find a natural predator that maybe consumes that organism. So we went over the example of the beetle, but there are other examples, ladybugs, certain types of wasps, even a bacteria can be used. So if you remember in our previous lecture when we talked about GMOs and we talked about using genetically modified organisms, We can also sometimes introduce a strain of bacteria. If you remember, we talked about BT corn, so that's Bacillus thuringiensis, and that can be used to kill sometimes something dangerous or a dangerous pest in a crop production system that can eventually allow us to depend on pesticides less. So we don't really depend on the pesticide as much, and we then have a natural predator that can be used to control another species. And this isn't always perfect. It sometimes has problems associated with it, but it at least offers an alternative to relying just on harmful chemicals. Another mechanism of sustainable agriculture is intercropping, and this is growing one crop and then right next to it growing a different crop, and then next to that growing another crop. You could have 3, 4 different crops grown in the same land space, and that can be really helpful because you're making sure that the soil in the area isn't producing just one product. You're increasing the diversity in the area. Also, you can plant things that the same pest doesn't like, and so that way you're making sure that the pest doesn't just have 100 acres of their favorite food, right? You're interspersing that with other crops, so that can help decrease the amount of pests that are attracted into the area. And so this is one way that, again, it isn't a perfect method, but it's been shown to really improve the health of an ecosystem by rotating the crops. So what are some other practices of sustainable agriculture? What are some ways in which our production of food can be improved in the future, right? And so all of these sustainable agricultural practices aren't used currently, but the idea is we could use them more and could move in the United States more towards sustainable agriculture. So one of the ways is by not tilling the ground, right? So not agitating the soil as much, definitely using less pesticides. Being very careful about how we water plants. So drip irrigation can run sometimes very small pipes along all of the plants that are being grown and provide water just drip by drip, and that has been shown to be really successful. Improving the fertility of the soil, right? Oftentimes using naturally occurring organisms as pest control, making sure that we don't produce a lot of waste, right? Being very precise about what we grow and where we grow it. Using a lot of heat tolerant crops, so that way you don't need to use as much water. There's so many different methods to improve the types of crops that are produced in an area rather than just relying on heavy pesticides and large amounts of water usage and miles and miles and miles of one crop. There are large portions of the Midwest that are covered in just corn, and that is sort of the agriculture of the past, and the idea is that if we move more in the future towards sustainable agriculture, we can improve the ecosystems for our planet. So this chapter has given you a really good introduction into how agriculture produces the crops that we depend upon as our major food source, and then has given you kind of a glimpse into how agriculture could change in the future and how it could possibly improve. So hopefully in your lifetime you'll be able to see a lot of these sustainable practices become more common, and then hopefully a lot of the pesticides will become less common. So that's kind of our hope for the future, and I hope you've enjoyed learning about agriculture a little bit more in this video. And if you have any questions, or if something was confusing to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm always available for questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. So I hope you have a great day, and now is a great time to open up your textbook in Canvas and review it and go over some of the key parts of the chapter and see what you understand, see what you remember from the lecture, and then review it, maybe take some notes, and that way you'll be ready when you see questions about this lecture. Okay, so I hope you have a great day.